Hello and welcome to the summary of the J. Robert Oppenheimer biography written by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. Now, you might already know that Christopher Nolan's movie Oppenheimer is coming out this July, and I thought it would be interesting to read the biography on which the movie's based, and I kind of thought it would just be a quick background thing, but one paragraph in, I was absolutely hooked. Now, it's 800 pages, which is why this video is a little long, but I would highly recommend it. The content of this video is strictly from the book. I didn't add any outside sources. I did separate this into chapters because it is quite a lot. Anyway, yeah. Onto the video. 4 days before Christmas in 1953, Robert Oppenheimer's life was suddenly turned upside down. He'd just received a letter from the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. The letter informed him that a new review of his background and policy recommendations had resulted in his being declared a security risk, and it went on to delineate 34 charges, which we'll get to later on. The book starts with Oppenheimer on his way to his friend and lawyer Herbert Mark's house because of this letter. Just a few years earlier, in the late 1940s, Oppenheimer was lauded as one of the most respected and admired scientists and public advisors of his generation. So how did it all come to this? Well, before we get there, part 1 of the book explores Robert's childhood, adolescence, and his 20s. J. Robert Oppenheimer was born on April 22, 1904, to second-generation German immigrants in New York. Though the family was Jewish, they never belonged to a synagogue and instead chose to practice an offshoot of Judaism known as the Ethical Culture Society, which is described as a progressive brand of secular humanism, a culture that valued independent inquiry, empirical exploration, and the free-thinking mind. So in short, the values of science. Robert's father, Julius Oppenheimer, was born in Germany in 1871, and he arrived in New York in 1886, where he became one of the most knowledgeable fabrics men in the city and a partner in Rothfeld, Stern and Company, a company founded by his cousins. And this company imported men's suit linings. Julius met a young painter named Ella Friedman. She was quite successful, having studied art in Paris, and by the time she met Julius, she was an accomplished enough painter to have her own students and a private rooftop studio in a New York apartment building. All this was unusual for a woman at the turn of the century, but Ella was a powerful personality in many respects. Julius and Ella were wed on March 23, 1903, and a year later, Robert was born. So the J in J. Robert Oppenheimer stands for Julius's father's name. Theirs was a life of relative privilege, with their painting collection including Picasso, Van Gogh, Rembrandt, and more. They had 3 live-in maids and even a governess. Robert learned to sail at the summer home that Julius purchased in Long Island, and by 1914, when World War I broke out in Europe, Julius Oppenheimer was a very prosperous businessman. His net worth totaled more than several $100,000, which made him the equivalent of a millionaire today. In 1912, when Robert was 8 years old, Ella gave birth to another son, Frank Friedman Oppenheimer. Robert had always loved science, but in his junior year, he had a breakthrough when he took a course in physics with Augustus Klock. He took chemistry the following year and, in his own words, said, "I loved chemistry so deeply compared to physics. It starts right in the heart of things, and very soon you have that connection between what you see and a really very sweeping set of ideas which could exist in physics, but it is very much less likely to be accessible." Robert would later credit Klock for setting him on that path. The boys, Frank and Robert's parents, were very encouraging of their hobbies. Robert was an avid sailor, and when he was 16, Julius bought him a 28-foot sloop, a sailing boat of some kind. Robert christened the boat Trinity, a name derived from the chemical compound trimethylene dioxide. At 19, in September 1922, Robert Oppenheimer enrolled at Harvard University. Although the university awarded him a fellowship, he didn't accept it because he could have done without the money. In lieu of the scholarship, Harvard gave him a volume of Galileo's early writings. Robert had some friends at Harvard, but they commented that he found social adjustment difficult. Robert kind of retreated into himself and suffered bouts of melancholy. He did have a roommate for 2 of his remaining years at Harvard, a friend who acknowledged Robert's eccentricities, but he also later credited Robert for inspiring his career in medical research. Oppenheimer's approach to learning physics was eclectic, even haphazard. He focused on the most interesting abstract problems in the field, bypassing the dreary basics. Years later, he confessed to feeling insecure about the gaps in his knowledge. To this day, he told an interviewer in 1963, "I get panicky when I think about a smoke ring or elastic drastic vibrations. There was nothing there, just a little skin over a hole.
In the same way, my mathematical formation was, even for those days, very primitive.
In 1925, he graduated summa cum laude with a degree in chemistry and made the dean's list at Harvard. Still, it was physics that called to him. Robert then went to study at Cambridge.
Robert's arrival at Cavendish Laboratory
in Cambridge coincided with a time of great excitement in the world of physics. By the early 1920s, some European physicists, Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, among others, were building a theory that they called quantum physics or quantum mechanics. Robert was desperately unhappy at Cambridge. This was compounded by the fact that his old friends were moving on with their lives, and they were moving on to lives of domesticity. They didn't have time to devote to the friendship like they did at Harvard. Robert also had some issues with one of his head tutors, Patrick Blackett, and late that autumn of 1925, Robert did something so stupid that it seemed calculated to prove that his emotional distress was overwhelming him. Consumed by feelings of inadequacy and intense jealousy, he poisoned an apple with chemicals from the lab and left it on Blackett's desk. Fortunately, Blackett didn't eat the apple, but university officials somehow were informed of the incident. Since Robert's parents were at Cambridge visiting him at the time, his father Julius lobbied on his behalf for the university not to press charges. Robert was instead put on probation and he had to see a psychologist. That was the condition for him staying at the university. For a time, Robert really struggled with his mental health and eventually it turned violent in an incident with a friend. In a hotel room in Paris, he was sitting with his good friend Ferguson, who had told Robert that he just proposed to his girlfriend. Robert kind of snapped then and tried to choke Ferguson with a trunk strap. Though Ferguson kept his guard up for the next few months, Robert did apologize and they went on to remain friends. After a 10-day trip to Corsica later with friends, Robert returned to Cambridge a little less troubled. He'd still have his bouts of depression, but the general trajectory of his mental health was positive. Later, with his mental health on the mend, Oppenheimer worked steadily on what would become his first major paper in theoretical physics, a study of the collision or continuous spectrum problem. In the summer of 1926, Robert traveled to Göttingen, a small medieval town in Germany. The book says that if Cambridge could claim to be Europe's great center for experimental physics, Göttingen was undoubtedly the center of theoretical physics. Robert arrived there just before an extraordinary revolution in theoretical physics due to its close.
Max Planck's discovery of quanta, photons, Einstein's magnificent achievement, the special theory of relativity, Niels Bohr's description of the hydrogen atom, Werner Heisenberg's formulation of matrix mechanics, and Erwin Schrödinger's theory of wave mechanics.
While there, Robert found himself in the company of some great intellectuals and scientists. He'd studied with James Franck, who'd won a Nobel Prize a year earlier, and the like, and Robert seemed to draw the attention of these men. In contrast to Cambridge, at Göttingen, Oppenheimer felt a pleasant camaraderie with his fellow students. I was part of a little community of people who had some common interests and tastes and many common interests in physics. At Harvard and Cambridge, Robert's intellectual pursuits had been solitary forays into books. At Göttingen, for the first time, he realized that he could learn from others. Something which for me, more than most people, is important began to take place. Namely, I began to have some conversations. Gradually, I guess, they gave me some sense, and perhaps more gradually, some taste in physics. Something that I probably would never have gotten to if I'd been locked up in a room. While at Cambridge, Robert had also presented 2 papers. Both represented small but important advances in quantum theory, and Oppenheimer was pleased to learn that the Cambridge Philosophical Society had published them by the time he arrived in Göttingen, so his reputation certainly preceded him. In 1927, after a quick side trip with physicist Paul Dirac to Leiden, Robert sailed back to New York, bringing back a hard-earned doctorate. Among theoretical physicists, it was known that young Oppenheimer had first-hand knowledge of the latest European breakthroughs in quantum mechanics. Barely 2 years after graduating from Harvard, Robert was a rising star in his field. That summer, he spent time with his parents and his brother. He'd also accepted a teaching post at Caltech in Pasadena, which would start after his 6-week break. Pasadena ended up being a good experience for him, and despite publishing a few papers while he was there, he wrote to a friend that the place was so pleasant he had trouble finding time to work. In the spring of 1928, Robert had received numerous attractive offers from universities. He decided to go to Leiden to study under the admired physicist Paul Ehrenfest. Ehrenfest found the experience really draining. Robert was obviously gifted, but he lacked mental discipline. He was well liked though. Only 6 weeks after his arrival, Oppenheimer astonished his peers by giving a lecture in Dutch, yet another language he taught himself. His Dutch friends were so impressed by the spirited delivery that they began to call him Opje, an affectionate contraction of his last name, and he'd bear that new nickname for the rest of his life. Anyway, after this, Robert headed to Zurich, and he left Zurich in 1929 to return to the States, and he'd already established by then an international reputation for his work in theoretical physics. Between 1926 and 1929, he published 16 papers, an astonishing output for any scientist. By the way, between his studies, travels, and his teaching, Robert often traveled to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to spend time there in the outdoors, hiking and riding in the mountains. He'd written to one of his friends once that his two loves were physics and New Mexico. He would also go on to buy a ranch there and spend a lot of time there during the Manhattan Project years. More on that later. Robert lectured at Berkeley for some years. It was a chaotic start, but eventually he became a skilled lecturer. Soon it was clear that Opje had become a Pied Piper of theoretical physics. Word spread around the country that if you wished to enter this field, Berkeley was the place to do it.
By the way, it was a dual appointment at Berkeley and Caltech, so he lectured at both.
9 months later, on September the 1st, 1939, Oppenheimer and a student, Hartland Snyder, published a paper titled On Continued Gravitational Contraction. Historically, of course, the date is best known for Hitler's invasion of Poland and the start of World War II. But in its quiet way, this publication was also a momentous event. The physicist and science historian Jeremy Bernstein calls it one of the great papers in 20th century physics. At the time, it attracted little attention. Only decades later would physicists understand that in 1939, Oppenheimer and Snyder had opened the door to 21st century physics. Some physicists have suggested that Oppenheimer possessed the knowledge and resources to publish a comprehensive Bible of quantum physics. By 1935, he certainly had the material for such a book at hand. His basic lectures explaining quantum mechanics were so popular on campus that his secretary, Miss Rebecca Young, had his lecture notes mimeographed and sold them to the students. The proceeds were used for the physics department's Pesky Cash Fund. Had Oppenheimer gone one step further and compiled his lectures and papers, argues one colleague, his work would have made one of the finest textbooks on quantum physics ever written. In the spring of 1930, Julius and Ella visited Robert in Pasadena. There was also a deep economic recession at the time, but Julius had already retired, sold some of his properties and his interest in the company, so the family wasn't impacted financially. Julius also had some kind of trust fund set up for Robert to support him if he financially needed it. This way, Robert wouldn't have to give up his research. During the summer of 1931, Ella Oppenheimer fell ill and was diagnosed with leukemia. She died in October of that year when Robert was 27 years old, and he told a friend at the time that he was the loneliest man in the world. Julius and Robert did become closer after this, although the family was always close. Robert and Julius shared a cottage one winter in Pasadena. They'd have lunch together every day, and Robert would invite his father to his elite supper clubs. In his late 20s, Oppenheimer already seemed to be searching for an earthly detachment. He wished, in other words, to be engaged as a scientist with the physical world and yet detached from it. He was not seeking to escape to a purely spiritual realm. He wasn't seeking religion. What he sought was peace of mind. The Gita seemed to provide precisely the right philosophy for an intellectual keenly attuned to the affairs of men and the pleasures of the senses. 22-year-old Jean Tatlock met Robert in the spring of 1936. She was finishing her first year at the Stanford School of Medicine, which was in San Francisco at the time, and that autumn they grew closer as Robert began to court her. Robert had known Jean's father, who was a Chaucer scholar at Berkeley. Jean had studied English literature at Vassar, and she'd also spent a year abroad in Switzerland in a gap year before her studies. She was also what would be later called, in irony, a premature anti-fascist, an early opponent of Mussolini and Hitler. When a professor gave her Max Eastman's Artists in Uniform, hoping that it might serve as a sobering antidote to her holy-headed admiration of Russian communism, Jean confided to a friend, "I just wouldn't want to go on living if I didn't believe that in Russia everything is better." Before dating Tatlock, Robert had been dating several women, half a dozen at least. But things were different with Jean. He was devoted to her, and over the course of their more than 3 years together, she and her activism awakened in him his sense of social responsibility. And it wasn't just her. there was also a lot going on at the time. Robert became increasingly concerned about the treatment of the Jewish people in Germany. He still had family there, and he saw what the Depression was doing at home to his students. Their job prospects were bleak, and through them, I began to understand how deeply political and economic events could affect men's lives. I began to feel the need to participate more fully in the life of the community. Oppenheimer was sympathetic to the cause of the Spanish Republic, and so he made some donations to some Spanish relief groups. When Oppenheimer was asked in 1954 about these donations to the Communist Party, he explained, "I doubt that it occurred to me that the contributions might be directed to other purposes than those I had intended, or that such purposes might be evil. I did not then regard communists as dangerous, and some of their declared objectives seemed desirable. The Communist Party was often in the forefront of such progressive causes as desegregation, better conditions for migratory farm workers, and the fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War." And Oppenheimer gradually became active in a number of these causes. In that spring, Robert and 197 other Pacific Coast academics signed a petition urging President Roosevelt to lift the arms embargo on the Spanish Republic. Only a year after Hitler came into power in 1933, Oppenheimer was contributing sizable sums to assist German Jewish physicists to escape Nazi Germany. These were men he knew and admired. Similarly, he talked often of the anguish about the plight of his relatives in Germany. Some of his family from Germany had also resettled into New York at the time. It's noted that to some of his old friends, Robert's preoccupation with politics was a nuisance. They thought him too good a physicist to be mixed up in all of that. Robert also always had an interest in psychoanalysis. Oppenheimer's exploration of the psychological was encouraged by his intense, often mercurial relationship with Jean Tatlock, who was, after all, training to become a psychiatrist. He ended up studying psychoanalysis under the tutelage of a Marxist-Freudian analyst, Dr. Bernfield. On September 20, 1937, Julius Oppenheimer died of a heart attack at the age of 67. Robert had known that his father was no longer robust, but his sudden death came as a shock. In the nearly 6 years since Ella's death in 1931, Julius had developed a close and tender relationship with his sons. He visited them both frequently, and it was often the case that Robert's friends became his father's friends. Julius's fortune had diminished somewhat after the 8 years of depression. Even so, by the time of his death, his estate, divided equally between Robert and Frank, amounted to the still quite substantial sum of $392,602. The annual income from his inheritance gave each of the brothers an average of $10,000 to supplement earnings. But, as if to underscore a certain ambivalence about his wealth, Robert immediately wrote out a will leaving his entire estate to the University of California, earmarked for graduate fellowships. The brothers remained close as always. They were alike and yet not. No one disliked Frank Oppenheimer. He was the Oppio without the edge, endowed with much of the Oppenheimer brilliance and none of the abrasiveness. Frank also had an interest in physics, earning an undergrad degree in England. He'd also studied at Cambridge, but unlike Robert, he excelled at experimental physics. After his time in England, he went on to do a PhD in experimental physics at Caltech, on a merit scholarship. He spent 4 years on his doctorate, as opposed to Robert, who did his in 2, and this was partly because experimental physics had the tendency to be more time-consuming than theoretical. His 4 years was described as leisurely, though, because he enjoyed life outside of his studies as well, being an accomplished flautist, so much so that some of his friends and his brother thought that he probably could have played professionally. Frank went on to marry a French-Canadian woman named Jackie Kwan. She was an economics student at Berkeley. Robert advised Frank against marrying, but Frank did anyway. Later, he would also join the Communist Party under a false surname. Some of Frank's friends were also offended by his politics, which he was quite overt about. In 1943, a colleague of Frank's during his 2 years at Stanford University told an FBI agent that, in his opinion, Frank Oppenheimer had followed the lead and dictates of his brother, J. Robert Oppenheimer, on all of his political attitudes and affiliations. This anonymous source had it mostly wrong. Frank had joined the party independently against his brother's advice. The informant had one thing right, however. He assured the FBI that he believed both Oppenheimers were basically loyal to this country. The FBI would never resolve the question of whether or not Robert was a CP member, which is to say that there wasn't really any evidence that he was. Much of the evidence in the FBI files on this issue is circumstantial and contradictory. If a few of the FBI's informants claimed that Oppenheimer was a communist, most of its informants merely painted a portrait of a fellow traveler, and some emphatically denied that he was ever a party member. The Bureau had only its suspicions and conjectures of others. Only Oppenheimer himself knew, and he always insisted that he had never been a member of the Communist Party. On August 24th, 1939, the Soviet Union stunned the world by announcing on the previous day that it had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. 1 week later, World War II commenced when Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously invaded Poland. No issue of the day was more vigorously debated within the left intellectual circles than the August 1939 Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. Many American communists resigned from the party. As Chevalier put it with marked understatement, the Soviet-German pact confused and upset many people. In the summer of 1938, two physicists who had spent several months in the Soviet Union visited Oppenheimer at his ranch in New Mexico. Over the next week, they had several long conversations about what was taking place there. Russia is not what you think it is, they told an initially skeptical Oppenheimer. 16 years later, in 1954, Oppenheimer explained to his interrogators, "What they reported to me seemed so solid, so unfanatical, so true that it made a great impression, and it presented Russia, even when seen from their limited experience, as a land of purge and terror, of ludicrously bad management, and of long-suffering people." There seemed no reason, however, why news of Stalin's abuses should cause him to alter his principles or renounce his sympathies with the American left. The most relevant political fact about Oppenheimer was that in the 1930s, he was devoted to working for social and economic justice in America, and to achieve this goal, he chose to stand with the left. By 1939, Robert and Jean's relationship had deteriorated. He had proposed marriage, but Jean was mercurial. She would disappear for weeks or months at a time, and she'd taunt Robert about who she'd been with. Eventually, she did break up with him. And then, in August of 1939, Robert attended a garden party in Pasadena, and in the course of the afternoon, he was introduced to a 29-year-old married woman named Kitty Harrison. Bob Serber happened to witness the encounter. Kitty, he could see, was immediately mesmerized. She fell in love with Robert that day. At the end of the summer, Oppenheimer phoned Dr. Harrison to tell him that his wife was pregnant. The two men agreed that the thing to do was for Harrison to divorce Kitty so that Oppenheimer could marry her. It was all very civilized. Harrison told the FBI that he and the Oppenheimers were still on good terms and that he realized that they had modern views concerning sex. Kitty was studying biology and she intended to have a career as a botanist even though she was pregnant. Robert and Kitty hastily married, and their child, a son named Peter, born on May 12, 1941 in Pasadena. When he was 2 months old, Robert and Kitty asked some of their friends if they could take Peter and his German nanny for a time while Kitty rested. Their friends, the Chevaliers, agreed, taking Peter for 2 months. This rather unusual arrangement, however, may have had long-term consequences for mother and child. Kitty never properly bonded with Peter. Even a year later, friends noticed that it was always Robert who took them into the baby's room and showed him off with obvious pride and delight. Kitty seemed quite uninterested, this old friend said. On Saturday evening, December 6, 1941, Oppenheimer attended a fundraiser for veterans of the Spanish Civil War. He later testified the next day, after hearing of the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he decided that I had had about enough of the Spanish cause and that there were other and more pressing crises in the world. Oppenheimer and many other physicists around the country had known as early as February 1939 that an atomic bomb was a real possibility. A month before war broke out in Europe, September 1, 1939, Leo Szilard had persuaded Albert Einstein to sign his name to a letter written by Szilard addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt. The letter warned the president that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may be constructed. He pointed out that a single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. Ominously, he suggested that the Germans might already be working on such a bomb. I understand Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium from Czechoslovakian mines, which she has taken over. After this, Roosevelt established a uranium committee. Later in 1941, he replaced this with a high-powered group named the S1 Committee, comprised of men who believed that they were in a race against the Germans. Robert learned of the project in January 1942, and in May, Oppenheimer was formally appointed S1's Director of Fast Neutron Research with the curious title Coordinator of Rapid Rupture. Almost immediately, he began to organize a highly secret summer seminar of top theoretical physicists whose job it was to outline a bare-bones design of an atomic bomb. They began their deliberations by studying a previous man-made explosion, the detonation in 1917 of a fully loaded ammunition ship in Halifax, Nova Scotia. In this tragic accident, an estimated 5,000 tons of TNT had decimated 2.5 square miles of downtown Halifax and had killed 4,000 people. They quickly estimated that any fission weapon might easily explode with a force 2 to 3 times that of the Halifax explosion. Oppenheimer then directed his colleagues' attention to the development of the basic design of a fission device that could be small enough to be militarily deliverable. They quickly determined that a chain reaction could probably be achieved with a uranium core placed inside a metal sphere only 8 inches in diameter. Other design specifications required extremely precise calculations. At times, Robert despaired of being able to solve so many imponderables. He so feared that they were already in a losing race against the Germans that he impatiently dismissed any research efforts that seemed too time-consuming. Teller vividly recalled Oppenheimer saying with absolute conviction that only an atomic bomb could dislodge Hitler from Europe. By September 1942, Oppenheimer's name was floated within the bureaucracy as the obvious candidate to direct a secret weapons lab that would be dedicated to the development of an atomic bomb. The only problem was that the army still wouldn't give Robert security clearance. Guessing that it was because of his ties to communism, Robert said to a friend that he would distance himself from his communist friends. On September 18, 1942, Army Officer Colonel Leslie Groves formally took charge of the bomb project, officially designated the Manhattan Engineer District, but most often referred to as the Manhattan Project. Groves then met with Robert to put on a charm offensive, but Groves was most impressed by Robert's ambition and his suggestion that they build this lab out in an isolated rural location. He would later tell a reporter that Robert was a real genius. Groves had Robert in mind as director for this central lab, but nobody else was enthused by the idea. He didn't know anything about equipment. One Berkeley scientist remarked he couldn't run a hamburger stand. There wasn't anyone better than Robert though, so after a few weeks he was appointed director. By the autumn of 1942, it was more or less an open secret around Berkeley that Oppenheimer and his students were exploring the feasibility of a powerful new weapon associated with the atom. Steve Nelson, whose job it was to serve as the Communist Party's liaison to the Berkeley University community, had also heard the rumors about a new weapon. By the spring of 1943, the FBI had tapped Nelson's home. They heard Nelson talking about the professor, Robert, and how worried he was about his communist association, and that the professor kept him off the project, otherwise it would attract too much attention. The transcript of this lengthy conversation soon got the attention of the chief of counterintelligence, Boris T. Pash, who concluded that this was evidence of espionage and that his suspicions of Robert were well-founded. He briefed Groves, but there couldn't be any official charges because the wiretap was illegal. Before the Oppenheimers left Berkeley, they invited their friends, the Chevaliers, over for dinner. In what seemed like an inconsequential proposal at the time, Chevalier told Robert that a mutual acquaintance of theirs, Eltonton, solicited him to ask Robert to pass information about his scientific work to a diplomat Eltonton knew in the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. Robert brushed it aside, and Chevalier would later insist that he was just passing on the message. Chevalier would also write that Robert was actually disturbed by this, and they exchanged a word or two about it, but then they carried on with their evening, soon forgetting the whole thing. Upon being questioned by the FBI, both men confirmed that Robert rejected the idea out of hand. Robert was beginning a new life. As the director of the weapons laboratory that would integrate the diverse efforts of the far-flung sites of the Manhattan Project and mold them quickly into a usable atomic weapon, he would have to conjure up skills he did not yet have, deal with problems he had never imagined, develop work habits entirely at odds with his previous lifestyle, and adjust to attitudes and modes of behavior, such as security considerations, that were emotionally awkward and alien to his experience. It is not too much of an exaggeration to suggest that in order to succeed, age 39, Robert Oppenheimer would have to remake a significant part of his personality, if not his intellect, and he was going to have to do all of this in short order. Every aspect of his new job was on a fast-track schedule. Los Alamos would be the location for this new weapons lab, which worked out well for Robert because of his love for New Mexico. Oppenheimer got what he wanted, a spectacular view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and General Groves got a site so isolated there was only a winding gravel road and one phone line into the place. place. Over the next 3 months, construction crews built cheap barracks with shingled or tin roofs. Similar buildings were constructed to serve as crude chemistry and physics laboratories. Everything was painted army green. Oppenheimer at first greatly underestimated the magnitude of the job. The initial construction contract budgeted $300,000, but within a year, $7.5 million had been spent. When Los Alamos opened in March 1943, 100 scientists, engineers, and support staff converged on the new community. Within 6 months, there were 1,000, and a year later, there were 3,500 people living on the mesa. By the summer of 1945, Oppenheimer's wilderness outpost had grown into a small town of at least 4,000 civilians and 2,000 men in uniform. They lived in 300 apartment buildings, 52 dormitories, and some 200 trailers. The technical area alone enclosed 37 buildings, including a plutonium purification plant, a foundry, a library, an auditorium, and dozens of laboratories, warehouses, and offices. Even before Los Alamos opened in March 1943, Army counterintelligence instructed J. Edgar Hoover to suspend FBI surveillance of Oppenheimer. As of March 22, Hoover complied, but he instructed his agents in San Francisco to continue their surveillance of individuals who might have been connected with Oppenheimer in the Communist Party. Between 1939 and 1943, even though Robert was now married to Kitty, he would still see Jean occasionally, twice a year. He explained, "We had been very much involved with one another, and there was still very deep feeling when we saw each other. It's not clear if this was just an emotional bond or if they had an actual physical affair." Jean had also told a friend that she regretted not marrying Oppia. In June 1943, they met up, and according to FBI surveillance, they had dinner, drove to her apartment, and Oppia wasn't seen again until the next morning. It seems the relationship may have been physically intimate as well. They would have dinner again the next evening, and Jean drove him to the airport, and he left for New Mexico. He never saw Jean again. This sparked the interest of FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover, who believed that Jean might be some conduit for passing Soviet secrets to the Soviet intelligence. On June 29, 1943, just 2 weeks after Oppenheimer spent the night with Tatlock, Pash, Chief of Counterintelligence on the West Coast, wrote a memo to the Pentagon recommending that Oppenheimer be denied a security clearance and fired. Pash reported that he had information that Oppenheimer may still be connected with the Communist Party. Robert was still vital to the project though, so he was kept on. But for the following months, years even, he was surveilled some way or another. Even after the war, he was subjected to close physical and electronic surveillance. His past associations were raised repeatedly by congressional committees and the FBI, and he was made to understand repeatedly that he himself was a suspect of being a member of the Communist Party. In early 1944, Jean Tatlock took her own life. She was found in her bathtub by her father, and she had left a note wishing love to those who loved her and tried to help her, but she felt she was a liability and she felt paralyzed. Her father found some letters amongst her things, and he lit a fireplace and he burned the letters. He then called the police 4 hours later. There's no explanation as to what was in the letters, but maybe we can infer by what followed. After her death, her friends became aware that Jean had been struggling with her sexuality. Jackie Oppenheimer later reported Jean as telling her that her psychoanalysis had revealed latent homosexual tendencies. At the time, Freudian analysts regarded homosexuality as a pathological condition to be overcome. For Oppenheimer, Jean Tatlock's suicide was a profound loss. He had invested much of himself in this young woman. He had wanted to marry her, and even after his marriage to Kitty, he had remained a loyal friend to her in need and an occasional lover. He had spent many hours walking and talking her out of her depression, and now she was gone. He had failed. On April 22, 1943, Robert turned 39 years old, and in December of the following year, Kitty gave birth to their daughter Catherine, who they named Tyke. In 1945, Kitty decided that she wanted to visit her parents for a while. She and Robert were close, and she was proud of him, but she sometimes felt stifled by her life. It didn't help that she suffered from postpartum depression and started having issues with alcohol. Kitty took their son, Peter, with her, but left Catherine with a friend. Peter and Kitty were gone for 3.5 months. The strain on Robert over these incredibly intense 2 years was taking its toll. Physically, the toll was obvious. His coughing was incessant and his weight was down to 115 pounds, skin and bones for a man 5 feet 10 inches tall. His energy level never flagged, but he seemed to be literally disappearing little by little, day after day. The psychological toll was, if anything, harsher, albeit less obvious. Robert had spent a lifetime dealing with and managing his mental stresses. Nevertheless, Tyke's birth and Kitty's departure left him unusually vulnerable.
In December 1943, Niels Bohr arrived in Los Alamos. One evening, Bohr told Oppenheimer that Heisenberg was working quite vigorously on a uranium reactor that could produce a runaway chain reaction and thereby create an immense explosion. Though not himself a Nazi, Heisenberg was certainly a German patriot who had chosen to remain in Nazi Germany, Germany's most eminent physicist. If the Germans had an atomic bomb project, Heisenberg was the obvious candidate to direct it. Heisenberg later maintained that he had guardedly mentioned the uranium problem and tried to suggest to his old friend that while a fission weapon was quite possible in principle, it would require a terrific technical effort which one can only hope cannot be realized in this war. So, this discussion between Heisenberg and Bohr is the subject of some controversy because Heisenberg might have been saying that he and the German physicists actually wanted to convince the Nazi government that building this wasn't feasible. One thing is clear, however, Bohr came away from the encounter with a great fear that the Germans might end the war with an atomic weapon. Bohr would leave Los Alamos that spring, however, persuaded by intelligence reports that the Germans probably didn't have a bomb. If Bohr was convinced, then Oppenheimer too must have realized that the German physicists were in all likelihood far behind in the race to build a bomb. According to David Hawkins, Oppenheimer was told by General Groves at the end of 1943 that a German source had recently claimed that Germans had abandoned their early bomb program. By then, it was too late, because the men at Los Alamos were committed to building a bomb. In the autumn of 1944, the Soviets received the first of many intelligence reports directly from Los Alamos. One of the Soviet spies overlooked by counterintelligence was Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist with British citizenship, who had been previously passing British intelligence to the Soviets. Over the next year, Fuchs passed detailed written information to the Soviets about the problems and advantages of the implosion-type bomb design over the gun method. He was unaware that the Soviets were getting confirmation of his information from another Los Alamos resident. He was eventually arrested in 1950, and Opia said that nobody suspected a thing. If he was a spy, then he did a perfectly good job. The other spy was Ted Hall, one of the best young technicians when it came to creating a test implosion. While on a 14-day leave from Los Alamos, Hall boarded a train to New York City and simply walked into a Soviet trade office and gave a Soviet official a handwritten report on Los Alamos. It described the laboratory's purpose and listed the names of the leading scientists working on the bomb project. In the months that followed, Hall managed to pass the Soviets much additional information, including critical information on the design of the implosion bomb. Hall was the perfect walk-in spy. He knew what the Russians needed to know about the atomic bomb project. He needed nothing himself and expected nothing. His sole purpose was to save the world from a nuclear war that he believed was inevitable if the United States emerged from the war with an atomic monopoly. By late 1944, a number of scientists at Los Alamos began to voice their growing ethical qualms about the continued development of the gadget. Oppenheimer argued with his usual eloquence that, although they were all destined to live in perpetual fear, the bomb might also end all war. Such a hope, echoing Bohr's words, was persuasive to many of the assembled scientists. Still, later, when it became clear that the weapon would not be used on the Germans, that gave men pause because they thought that they'd be fighting the Nazis. Oppenheimer spoke, and his main argument essentially drew on Niels Bohr's vision of openness. The war, he argued, should not end without the world knowing about this primordial new weapon. The worst outcome would be if the gadget remained a military secret. If that happened, then the next world war would almost certainly be fought with atomic weapons. They had to forge ahead, he explained, to the point where the gadget could be tested. Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. As Harry Truman moved into the White House, the war in Europe was nearly won. But the war in the Pacific was coming to its bloodiest climax. On the evening of March 9th, 10th, 1945, 334 B-29 aircraft dropped tons of jellied gasoline, napalm, and high explosives on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 people and completely burned out 15.8 square miles of the city. The firebombing raids continued, and by July 1945, all but 5 of Japan's major cities had been razed and hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians had been killed. This was total warfare, an attack aimed at the destruction of a nation, not just its military targets. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his life, and 8 days later, Germany surrendered. Opia still championed being open about the project with the Russians, and one of the top military officers in the US, General Marshall, floated the idea that they could invite 2 Russian scientists to witness the test. This pleased Robert because Oppenheimer, and surely many others in the room, understood that they could not rush to stay ahead in atomic weapons without pushing the Russians into an arms race with the United States. At an interim committee meeting over lunch, someone raised the question of the use of the bomb on Japan. No notes were taken, but when the formal meeting resumed, the discussion continued to focus on the effect of the impending bombing. Secretary Stimson summarized what seemed to be a general agreement: that we could not give Japan any warning, that we could not concentrate on a civilian area, but that we should seek to make a profound psychological impression on as many of the inhabitants as possible. Oppenheimer voiced no disagreement with the choice of the defined target. Instead, he seemed to have initiated a discussion of whether several such strikes could be mounted simultaneously. He thought multiple atomic bombing would be feasible. General Groves vetoed this idea. Oppenheimer had played an ambiguous role in this critical discussion. He had vigorously advanced Bohr's notion that the Russians should soon be briefed about the impending new weapon. He had even persuaded General Marshall until Burns had effectively derailed the idea. On the other hand, he had evidently felt it prudent to remain silent, as General Groves made clear his intention to dismiss dissident scientists. The scientists in Los Alamos, working feverishly to test the plutonium implosion bomb model as soon as possible, had little time to think about how or whether their gadget should be used on Japan, but they also felt that they could rely on Oppenheimer. One day, Robert did explain that he wanted the Japanese to be alerted in some manner, but in a later meeting, an unidentified army officer dismissed this idea, saying that if the Japanese were warned, they'd follow the Americans and shoot them down. Oppenheimer was ambivalent. I've set forth my anxieties and the arguments against dropping the bomb, but I did not endorse them, he later reported. There was much that Oppenheimer did not know. As he later recalled, we didn't know beans about the military situation in Japan. We didn't know whether they could be caused to surrender by either means or whether the invasion was really inevitable. But in the backs of our minds was the notion that the invasion was inevitable because we had been told that. Among other things, Robert was unaware that military intelligence in Washington had intercepted and decoded messages from Japan indicating that the Japanese government understood the war was lost and they were seeking acceptable surrender terms. Truman's chief of staff informed Truman that before a final decision was taken to invade the Japanese home islands or to use the atomic bomb, political steps should be taken that might well secure full Japanese surrender. The Japanese, he said, should be told that they would be permitted to retain the emperor and a form of government of their choosing. In addition, he said, the Japanese should be told furthermore that we had another and terrifyingly destructive weapon which we would have to use if they did not surrender. No one can be certain of Oppenheimer's reaction had he learned that on the eve of the Hiroshima bombing, the president knew that the Japanese were looking for peace and that the military use of atomic bombs on cities was an option rather than a necessary for ending the war in August. But we do know that after the war, he came to believe that he had been misled, and this knowledge served as a constant reminder that it was henceforth his obligation to be skeptical of what he was told by the government officials. 2 weeks after Oppenheimer wrote his June 16th memo summarizing the views of the science panel, Edward Teller came to him with a copy of a petition that was circulating throughout the Manhattan Project's facilities. Drafted by Silzard, the petition urged President Truman not to use atomic weapons on Japan without a public statement of the terms of surrender. The United States shall not resort to the use of atomic bombs in this war unless the terms which will be imposed upon Japan have been made public in detail, and Japan, knowing these terms, has refused to surrender. Over the next few weeks, the petition garnered 155 signatures from the Manhattan Project scientists. Robert was annoyed by this petition and slow-walked it to Washington so that it didn't get there in time. One of his arguments was that these scientists couldn't know the right way to end the war. They knew nothing about Japanese psychology. Initially, General Groves had opposed the idea of a test of the implosion bomb, on the grounds that plutonium was so scarce that not an ounce should be wasted. Oppenheimer convinced him that a full-scale test was absolutely necessary because of the incompleteness of our knowledge. Without a test, he told Groves, the planning of the use of the gadget over enemy territory will have to be done substantially blindly. Oppenheimer dubbed the test site Trinity, and he had delegated Ken Bainbridge to supervise preparations at the Trinity site, but he also sent his brother Frank to serve as Bainbridge's chief administrative assistant. Richard Feynman was standing 20 miles from the Trinity site when he was handed dark glasses. He decided he wouldn't see anything through the dark glasses, so instead he climbed into the cab of a truck. The truck windshield would protect his eyes from harmful ultraviolet rays, and he'd be able to actually see a flash. Even so, he reflectively ducked when the horizon lit up with a tremendous flash. When he looked up again, he saw a white light changing into yellow and then orange. A big ball of orange, the center that was so bright, becomes a ball of orange that starts to rise and billow a little bit and get a little black around the edges. And then you see its big ball of smoke with flashes on the inside of a fire going out. The heat. A full minute and a half after the explosion, Feynman finally heard an enormous bang, followed by the rumble of man-made thunder. Bob Serber commented that he could feel the heat on his face from 20 miles away. A chemist, Joe Hirschfelder, described the blast. All of a sudden, the night turned into day and it was tremendously bright. The chill turned into warmth. The fireball gradually turned from white to yellow to red as it grew in size and climbed into the sky. We stood there in awe as the blast wave picked up chunks of dirt from the desert soil and soon passed us by. Oppenheimer later said that at the sight of the unearthly mushroom cloud soaring into the heavens above Point Zero, he recalled lines from the Gita. In a 1965 NBC television documentary, he remembered, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent." I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that, one way or another. There was a celebratory atmosphere after the successful Trinity test, but shortly afterwards, Oppenheimer grew sad. "Those poor little people," he sadly commented. That very week, however, Oppenheimer was working hard to make sure that the bomb exploded efficiently over those poor little people. On the evening of July 23, 1945, he met with General Thomas Farrell and his aide, two senior officers designated to supervise the bombing run over Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, at exactly 8:14 a.m., the untested gun-type uranium bomb was dropped over Hiroshima. The effects were greater than the Trinity test, and 3 days later, another bomb devastated Nagasaki. A day after Nagasaki was devastated by the plutonium bomb, the Japanese government sent an offer of surrender with one condition, that the status of Japan's emperor be guaranteed. The next day, the Allies agreed to alter the terms of the unconditional surrender. The authority of the emperor to rule would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. On August 14th, Radio Tokyo announced the government's acceptance of this clarification and, therewith, its surrender. The war was over, and within weeks, journalists and historians began to debate whether it might have ended on similar terms and around the same time without the bomb. Robert was now rather depressed, consumed with qualms over what had happened. Yeah, this sentence is bizarrely written in the book in a passive way, because it's not really what had happened, it's what they did. Anyway, Phil Morrison, one of Robert's grad students, landed on Nagasaki 30 days after the bombing. Virtually everyone in the street for nearly a mile around was instantly and seriously burned by the heat of the bomb. The hot flash burned suddenly and strangely. They, the Japanese people, told us of people who wore striped clothing upon whom the skin was burned in stripes. There were many who thought themselves lucky, who crawled out of the ruins of their homes only slightly injured, but they died anyway. They died days or weeks later from the radiation-like rays emitted in great numbers at the moment of the explosion. Robert knew that the Manhattan Project had made a weapon of mass destruction, the culmination of 3 centuries of physics, and in doing so, he thought, the project had impoverished physics, and not just in a metaphysical sense, and soon he began to disparage it as a scientific achievement. "We took this tree with a lot of ripe fruit on it," Oppenheimer told a Senate committee in late 1945, "and shook it hard, and out came radar and atomic bombs. The whole wartime spirit was one of frantic and rather ruthless exploitation of the known. The war had a notable effect on physics," he said. It practically stopped it. After this, Robert Oppenheimer became a household name, and he grew comfortable with the adulation over time, giving speeches about this terrible weapon that they had made, and at least in American media, they saw this as an achievement that was to be celebrated. On August 30th, 1945, 500 scientists in Los Alamos came together to form a new organization, the Association of Los Alamos Scientists, ALAS. They also drafted a strongly worded statement on the dangers of an arms race, the impossibility of any defense against the atomic bomb in the
future wars, and the need for international control. Oppenheimer was asked to forward the document, as it became known, to the War Department. Everyone fully expected that the statement would shortly be released in the press. The administration was very slow to respond, however, and when Oppia flew to Washington, he got the news that the administration decided to classify the document. What surprised the scientists was that Oppia defended the administration's decision to do this. It seemed that the more time Robert spent in Washington, D.C., the more compliant he became with the administration. Needless to say, this was upsetting to the Alas scientists, but Oppia insisted that there was a good reason for the classification. The Truman administration was about to propose legislation on atomic energy, and he explained that they should wait as a matter of courtesy until President Truman released his own message on atomic energy to Congress before any public debates on the matter. When President Truman issued his message to Congress on October 3rd, 1945, many scientists initially thought it reassuring because it reflected Oppia's own sense of urgency about both the dangers and the potential benefits of atomic energy. Oppenheimer thought he had won the president's commitment to seek the abolition of atomic weapons. However, the May-Johnson bill was a piece of legislation that was introduced the next day, and it was in stark contrast to the president's speech. It read as a victory for the military. Scientists who read it became alarmed. The bill proposed to centralize all power over atomic energy in the hands of a 9-member commission appointed by the president. Military officers would be allowed to sit on the commission. Scientists were subject to prison terms of up to 10 years for even minor security violations. In his own Senate testimony on October 17, 1945, Oppenheimer confessed that his prepared statement had been written considerably before he actually read the bill. Frank Oppenheimer argued with his brother. An activist in Alice, Frank believed it was time to go public and try to educate citizens about the need for international controls. He said there wasn't time for this, recalled Frank. He'd been in the Washington scene, he saw that everything was moving, and he felt that he had to change things from within. Perhaps Robert was making a calculated gamble that he could use his prestige and tactics to persuade the Truman administration to take a quantum leap towards international controls, and he really didn't care if this was done under a civilian or a military atomic regime, or perhaps he simply could not bring himself to press for a policy that might lead the administration to define him as an outsider, a troublemaker. He wanted to sit center stage during the first act of this atomic age. All this was too much for Robert Wilson, who rewrote the suppressed Alas document and mailed it to the New York Times, which promptly published the statement on its front page. Mailing it was a serious violation of security, Wilson later wrote. For me, it was a declaration of independence from our leaders. To the surprise of many in Washington, the energetic lobbying of the scientists defeated the May-Johnson bill. In its place, a new bill was introduced which proposed to give control over nuclear energy policy to an exclusively civilian Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC. While many of his peers, including his own brother, were baffled by Oppia's initial support of the May-Johnson bill, no one held it against him for very long. His ambivalence about the whole issue had been justified. If he had failed to challenge the Pentagon's agenda, he had nevertheless understood that the truly important problem was achieving effective international controls against the manufacture of atomic bombs. Oppia did speak to President Truman on October 25, 1945. He again emphasized the need for international controls, and after the conversation, finally sensing that the president was not comprehending the deadly urgency of his message, Oppenheimer nervously wrung his hands and uttered another of those regrettable remarks that he characteristically made under pressure. "Mr. President," he said quietly, "I feel I have blood on my hands." Anyway, Oppia continued to be outspoken about his fears, and he was influential, which got the attention of J. Edgar Hoover, who started the suspicious communist ties talk again. By the end of 1945, the FBI had a wiretap in Frank's home outside Berkeley. Oppenheimer still felt anguish and personal responsibility for the consequences of his work at Los Alamos. He was also distressed by the thought of nuclear terrorism. On July 1st, 1946, the world's fourth atomic bomb exploded above the lagoon of Bikini Atoll, a part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. A fleet of abandoned Navy vessels of all shapes and sizes were either sunk or exposed to murderous radiation. A large crowd of congressmen, journalists, and diplomats from numerous countries, including the Soviet Union, witnessed this demonstration. Oppenheimer had been one of the many scientists invited to see the show, but he was conspicuously absent. In September of the same year, FBI agents showed up to Oppia's office wanting to question him about the whole Chevalier Eltonton affair from years earlier. In 1947, Oppia, Kitty, and their children arrived at Princeton, New Jersey, because he was about to start his post as director-elect of the Institute for Advanced Study. Peter is 6 years old at this time, Tony 3, and Robert 43. By the way, Robert and Kitty's daughter, Catherine or Tyke, later went by the name Tony. Interesting, this is the institution that was home to Albert Einstein. Oppenheimer's relationship with the Institute's most famous resident was always tentative. "We were close colleagues," he later wrote of Einstein, "and something of friends, but he thought of Einstein as a living patron saint of physics, not a working scientist." Einstein was equally ambivalent about Oppia. He wasn't a fan of Oppia's appointment to the job at first, but he came to begrudgingly respect him. They weren't friends though. Back in the 1930s, Oppia had once called Einstein completely cuckoo for his stubborn refusal to accept quantum theory. To Oppenheimer's sorrow, Einstein devoted his Princeton years trying to prove that quantum theory was flawed by significant inconsistencies. These disputes, however, did not prevent Oppenheimer from enjoying Einstein's company. In the spring of 1949, Frank and Robert were the target of some congressional investigations. 4 of Robert's former students were also subpoenaed, and one of the members of the committee was a former FBI agent. Of course, the investigators were not interested in nuclear weapons, but atomic spies and the Soviet connection. Oppia managed to make it through the hearings relatively unscathed, but his former students' careers were never the same. Frank testified under oath that he and Jackie had been members of the Communist Party for 3 years, something that he had always previously denied. Because of this lie, even though he was being honest during the hearings, he lost his job as a professor of physics at the University of Minnesota. He had been 3 months away from earning tenure. He and Jackie had previously bought an 800-acre cattle ranch in the Colorado mountains, and after losing his career in academia, he spent the next decade being a rancher. Robert visited every summer, but it chafed him that this was his brother's life now. Frank would get job offers to teach physics abroad, but the Department of State refused to issue him a passport. Within years, he had to sell his Van Gogh paintings for $40,000. Home life in Princeton for the Oppenheimers wasn't going well either. Kitty's drinking was getting out of control. A free-spirited, whimsical woman, Kitty found it impossible to fit into Princeton's stiff, small-town, high-society scene. She was rather lonely and didn't have lasting friendships. She would start these really intense friendships and then eventually publicly denigrate her friends. It was as though she needed to hurt people. She would fall asleep while smoking cigarettes, so her sheets were full of cigarette holes. Robert reacted rather stoically to her self-destructive behavior. He did once confess that he had sought the help of a psychiatrist about Kitty, but he was advised to have her sent to an institution for a time, and that was something he could not do. And so, he accepted the consequences of that. He was also very dependent on her. She was his confidant. He resented any criticism of her. By all accounts, he was a good husband who stood by her, but he knew that he couldn't change things. At one point, he did have to intervene when Kitty almost accidentally overdosed on sleeping pills that she took for insomnia. He kept a lock on the medicine cabinet and dispensed the medicine to her himself. This didn't last very long though. On August 29th, 1949, the Soviet Union secretly exploded an atomic bomb at an isolated testing site in Kazakhstan. The Americans detected it and put together a panel to analyze the evidence. Oppia was on this panel. Oppia had hoped that this would encourage Truman to renew efforts to internationalize control over nuclear technology. Truman was not even aware of the possibility of a super, as in superfusion bomb, until 1949, but when he became aware, he was soon intrigued by it. Profoundly disturbed by the ethical implications of a weapon thousands of times more destructive than an atomic bomb, Oppia hoped that the super would prove technically unfeasible. More horrific than the atomic bomb, the super would surely escalate the nuclear arms race. Over the next 4 years, much changed. Relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, nuclear weapons emerged as the anchor of Americans' emerging containment policy, and the US nuclear arsenal expanded to more than 100 atomic bombs, with more and larger ones on the way. For 5 years, Oppia tried but failed to convince Washington, and he retreated to Princeton. The administration now supported a program to build a bomb 1,000 times as lethal as the Hiroshima weapon. Still, Oppenheimer would not upset the apple cart. He would remain an insider, albeit one who was increasingly outspoken and increasingly suspect. Oppia's connection with communism was once again raised, and the FBI began investigating him again. Since Hiroshima, Oppenheimer had lived with such a peculiar sense that someday his own beast in the jungle would emerge to alter his existence. For some years now, he had known that he was a hunted man, and if there was a beast in the jungle waiting for him, it was Louis Strauss. The initiation of Strauss's campaign to destroy Oppenheimer's reputation can thus be precisely dated. It began on the afternoon of May 25th, 1953, with his appointment with the president. He he began to orchestrate a public campaign against Robert, and Eisenhower, who was president at the time, would soon issue a directive to have Oppia investigated, to have all the previous files re-evaluated. On December 21st, 1953, Strauss told Oppia of a letter questioning his security clearance. Oppia was given a chance to read the letter, and he went straight to his lawyer's house, and this is where the story began. Over the next few weeks, Robert worked feverishly to prepare a defense. The AEC had given him a 30-day deadline to reply to the charges, and during this time, Robert and those close to him were under FBI surveillance. The FBI also did not care about potentially breaching attorney-client privilege during these surveillances. Einstein thought that the charges against Oppia were absurd, but he was truly alarmed by McCarthyism. Back in early 1951, Einstein wrote to his friend Queen Elizabeth of Belgium that here in America, quote, "The German calamity of years ago repeats itself. People acquiesce without resistance and align themselves with the forces of evil." Einstein now feared that by cooperating with the government's security board, Oppenheimer would not only humiliate himself, but would lend legitimacy to the whole poisonous process. On March 5th, 1954, Oppenheimer's 42-page response was delivered to the AEC. The hearing board convened on Monday, April 12th, 1954, and Oppia and his team were late. Nevertheless, the indictment and Oppia's response were read out. He was on trial, and his crimes included joining numerous CP organizations, being intimately associated with known communists such as Jean Tatlock and others, and failing to report that conversation with Chevalier about George Eltonton's proposal. The charges were based on illegal FBI wiretaps, and they weren't even admissible in court, and because Oppia's lawyers were barred from hearing the contents of the tapes, they couldn't challenge them. Some of the tapes were transcribed in a way that made it appear as though that information was more damaging than it really was. On May 6, 1954, the trial was over and Oppia returned to Princeton to await the board's judgment, which came on May 23rd. By a vote of 2-1, the board deemed Oppenheimer a loyal citizen who was nevertheless a security risk. The recommendation was that his security not be restored. They did not accuse Oppenheimer of violating any laws or even security regulations, but his association gave evidence of a certain indefinable ill judgment. Oppenheimer's lawyers briefly hoped that the 5 AEC commissioners would reverse the board's decision, but the AEC would eventually uphold the ruling. Ironically, publicity surrounding the trial and its verdict enhanced Oppenheimer's fame both in America and abroad. Where he was once known only as the father of the atomic bomb, now he had become something even more alluring, a scientist martyred like Galileo. Many Americans began to regard Oppenheimer as a scientist martyr, a victim of the era's McCarthyite excesses. As time went by, Oppenheimer became more visible as an international celebrity. He began to travel abroad more often. In 1960, he traveled to Tokyo, where reporters greeted him at the airport with a barrage of questions. "I do not regret," he said softly, "that I had something to do with the technical success of the atomic bomb. It isn't that I don't feel bad, it is that I don't feel worse tonight than I did last night." The translation of that ambiguously loaded sentiment into Japanese could not have been easy. By the early 1960s, with the return of the Democrats to the White House, Oppenheimer was no longer a political pariah. The Kennedy administration was not going to bring him back into the government, but liberal Democrats nevertheless thought of him as an honorable man martyred by Republican extremists. In the spring of 1963, Oppenheimer learned that President Kennedy had announced his intention to give him the prestigious Enrico Fermi Prize, a $50,000 tax-free award and medal for public service. However, on November 22, 1963, Oppenheimer was sitting in his office working on a draft acceptance speech for the December 2nd White House ceremony when he heard knocking on his outer office door. It was Peter, who said that he had just heard on his car radio that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. On December 2nd, President Lyndon Johnson went ahead with the Fermi Award ceremony as scheduled. Everyone understood that this was a highly symbolic act of political rehabilitation. In the spring of 1965, Oppia announced his intention to retire at the end of the term from the Institute. He was 2 years from retirement, Kitty had been diagnosed with an incurable illness, and the third reason he gave was the intolerable and worsening state of his relationship with with some of the members of the maths faculty at the institute. In 1965, Robert's smoker's cough became noticeably worse. He complained of a terribly sore throat, and in February 1966, he was diagnosed with cancer. 4 decades of heavy tobacco smoke had taken its toll on his throat. He had radiation treatment, and in mid-July, doctors found no traces of malignancy in his throat. The radiation treatment had tired him out, but it appeared to have done the job. By October, the cancer would come back, and it spread into the palate, the base of the tongue, and the left eustachian tube. He would have to go through additional radiation treatments. But on January 6, 1967, Robert's doctor told him that the radiation therapy was proving ineffective against his cancer. By mid-February 1967, Robert knew that the end was near. "I am in some pain. My hearing and my speech are very poor," he wrote a friend. His doctors had decided that he couldn't take any more radiation, so they ordered a strong regimen of chemotherapy. Robert Oppenheimer died in his sleep at 10:40 p.m. on Saturday, February 18, 1967. He was only 62 years old. Kitty later confided to a friend, "His death was pitiful. He turned into a child first, then an infant. He made noises. I couldn't go into the room. I had to go into the room, but I couldn't. I couldn't bear it." 2 days later, his remains were cremated. So there is an epilogue, and it's quite sad. Within a year or two of Oppia's death, Kitty began living with Bob Serber, Robert's close friend and former student. Kitty eventually died of an embolism on October 27, 1972. In 1959, 10 years after his banishment, Frank Oppenheimer finally made it back into academia when the University of Colorado gave him an appointment in the physics department. In 1965, he won a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship to do bubble chamber research at the University College in London. Peter Oppenheimer, Kitty and Robert's son, moved to New Mexico, living in his father's cabin overlooking the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Over the years, he raised 3 children, twice divorced, and he eventually settled in Santa Fe and made a living as a contractor and carpenter. Peter never advertised his familial connections to the father of the atomic bomb, even when he occasionally went canvassing door to door as an environmental activist, lobbying against nuclear waste hazards in the region. After her father's death, Toni floundered. Using her faculty for languages, she got a temporary job in 1969 as a trilingual translator for the United Nations. The position, however, required a security clearance. The FBI opened a full field investigation and dredged up all the old charges about her father. In what must have been a painful and ironic blow to a tender ego, the security clearance never came through. Denied her chosen career by the FBI, she never seemed to recover her footing. She took her life on Sunday afternoon, January 1977. And yeah, that's it. Feel free to share your thoughts if you've read it, and thank you for watching.